Charles stepped into Funland Amusement and ground his teeth at the sight of children playing skee-ball and air hockey and the waka 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 of Pac-Man that filled the air. The great Gizmo, reduced to playing chess in a place like this. The owner started to say something to the well-dressed gentleman, but Charles waved him off. He didn't need directions. He and Gizmo were old friends, and he could practically smell the old gypsy from here. That was one of those words his great-great-grandchildren would have told him was a cancelable offense, but Charles didn't care. Much like the great Gizmo, Charles was from a different age. Charles had first met Gizmo in 1919, when the world was still new and things made sense. It had been at an expo in Coney Island, and his father had been rabid to see it. "They say it's from Europe, and it's been touring since the 1800s. It's supposed to play chess like a grandmaster, Charlie boy, and they claim it's never been beaten. I want you to be the first one to do it, kiddo." Charlie's father had been a trainman, an engineer, and a grease monkey who had never gotten farther than the 5th grade. He had learned everything he knew at the side of better men, but he knew Charlie was special. Charles was 9 and already doing high school math, and not just reading Shakespeare, but understanding what he meant, doing numbers good enough to get a job at the broker's house if he wanted it. His father wouldn't hear of it, though. No genius son of his was going to run numbers for bingo boys, not when he could get an education and get away from this cesspool. Education, Charlie, that's what's going to lift you above the rest of us. Higher learning is what's going to get you a better life than your old man. One thing his dad did love, though, was chess. Most of the train guys knew the typical games: cards, dice, checkers, chess. But Charlie's dad had loved the game best of all. He was no grand master, barely above a novice, but he had taught Charles everything he knew about it from a very young age. Charles had absorbed it like a sponge. He was one of the best in the boroughs, maybe one of the best in the city, and he'd taken 3rd in the Central Park chess finals just last year. And that was against guys 3 times your age, kid, his dad had crowed. Now, he wanted his son to take on the great Gizmo. The exhibition was taking place in a big tent not far from the show hall, and it was standing room only. Lots of people wanted to see this machine that could beat a man at chess, and they all wanted a turn to try it out. Most of them wouldn't, Charlie knew, but they wanted the chance to watch it beat better men than them so they could feel superior for a little while. Charles didn't intend to give them the satisfaction. The man who'd introduced the thing was dressed in a crisp red and white striped suit, his flat-topped hat making him look like a carnival barker. He had thumped his cane and called the crowd to order, his eyes roving the men and women as if searching for the right victim. "Ladies and gentlemen, what I have here is the most amazing technical marvel of the last century. He has bested kings, geniuses, and politicians in the art of chess, and is looking for his next challenge. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the great Gizmo." Charles hadn't been terribly impressed when the man tore back the tarp to reveal the thing. It looked like a fortune teller, dressed in a long red robe with a turban on its head, boasting a tall feather and a large gem with many facets. It had a beard, a long mustachio that dripped with rings and bells, and a pair of far too expressive eyes. It moved jerkily, like something made of wires, and the people oohed and awed over it, impressed. "Now then, who will be the first to test its staggering strategy? Only $5 for the chance to best the great Gizmo." Charlie's father had started to step forward, but Charles put a hand on his arm. Let's watch for a moment, Dad. I want to see how he plays." "You sure? I figured you'd stomp it first, and then we'd walk off with the glory." "I'm sure," Charles said, standing back to watch as the first fellow approached, paying his money and taking a seat. This was how Charles liked to play. First came the observation period, where he watched and made plans. He liked to stand back, blending in with the crowd so he could take the measure of his opponents. People rarely realized you were studying their moves, planning counter moves, and when you stepped up and trounced them, they never saw it coming. That was always his favorite part, watching their time-tested strategies fall apart as they played on and destroyed themselves by second-guessing their abilities. That hadn't happened that day in the tent at Coney Island. As much as he watched and as much as he learned, Charles never quite understood the strategies at play with the great Gizmo. He stuck to no gambits, he initiated no set strategy, and he was neither aggressive nor careful. He answered their moves with the best counter move available every time, and he never failed to thwart them. After 5 others had been embarrassed, to the general amusement of the crowd, Charles decided it was his turn. "A kid?" the barker asked. "Mister, I'll take your money, but I hate to steal from a man." His father had puffed up at that. "Charlie's a chess prodigy. He'll whip your metal man." And so, Charles took his seat, setting eye to glass eye with the thing, and the game began. Charles would play a lot of chess in his lifetime, but he would never play a game quite that one-sided again. The great Gizmo thwarted him at every move, countered his counters, ran circles around him, and by the end, Charles wasn't sure he had put up any sort of fight at all. He had a middling collection of pieces, barely anything, and Gizmo had everything. "Checkmate," the thing had rasped, its voice full of secret humor, and Charles had nodded before walking away in defeat. "No sweat, Charlie boy," his father had assured him. "Damn creepy thing's a cheat anyway. That's what it is, just a cheatin' bit of nothing." Charles hadn't said anything, but he had made a vow to beat the pile of wires next time the chance arose. Charles saw the great Gizmo sitting in the back of the arcade, forgotten and unused. He didn't know how much the owner had paid for it, but he doubted it was making it back. The great Gizmo was a relic. No one came to the arcade to play chess anymore. There was a little placard in front of him telling his history, and a sign that asked patrons not to damage the object. The camera overhead likely helped with that, but there was likely more to it than that. The great Gizmo looked like something that shouldn't exist, something that flew in the face of this uncanny valley that his great-grandson talked about sometimes, and people found it off-putting. Charles, however, was used to it. "Do you remember me?" he asked, putting a quarter in as the thing shuddered and seemed to look up at him. Its robes were faded, its feather ragged, but its eyes were still intelligent. "Charles," it croaked, just as it had on that long-ago day. Charles had been in his second year of high school when he met the great Gizmo for the second time. School was more of a formality than anything. He could pass any test that a college entrance board could throw at him, but they wouldn't give him the chance until he had a diploma. He was 16, a true prodigy now, and his chess skills had only increased over the years. He had taken Ruby Fawn to the fair that year, and that was where he saw the sign proclaiming the great Gizmo would be in attendance. He had drugged her over to the tent The girl saying that she didn't want to see that creepy old thing, but he wanted a second chance at it. His father was still working in the grease pits of the train yard, but he knew his face would light up when he heard how his son had bested his old chess rival. The stakes had increased in 7 years, it seemed. It was now $8 to play the champ, but the winner got a $50 cash prize. $50 was a lot of money in 1926, but Charles wanted the satisfaction of besting this thing more than anything. Despite what his father wanted, he had been running numbers for John McClure and his gang for over a year, and some well-placed bets had left him flush with cash. "Good luck, young man," said the Barker, and Charles was surprised to find that it was the same Barker as before. Time had not been kind to him. His suit was now faded, his hat frayed around the rim, and he'd put on weight which bulged around the middle and made the suit roll, spoiling the uniform direction of the stripes. Despite that, it was still him, and he grinned at Charles as he took his familiar seat. This time, the match was a little different. Charles had increased in skill, and he saw through many of the traps Gizmo set for him. The audience whispered quietly behind him, believing that the great Gizmo had met his match, but the real show was just beginning. Charles had taken several key pieces, and as he took a second rook, the thing's eyes sparkled, and it bent down as if to whisper something to him. The crowd would not have heard it. Its voice was too low, but the great Gizmo whispered a secret to Charles that would stick with him forever. "Charles, this will not be our last game. We will play 8 more times before the end." It was given in a tone of absolute certainty, not an offhanded statement made to get more of Charles's hard-earned money. Charles looked mystified, not sure if he had actually heard what the thing had said, and it caused him to flub his next move and lose a piece he had not wanted to. Charles persevered, however, pressing on and taking more pieces, and just as he believed that victory was within his grasp, the thing spoke again. "Charles, you will live far longer than you may wish to." Again, it was spoken in that tone of absolute assuredness, and it caused Charles to miss what would have been obvious. The great Gizmo won after 2 more moves, and Charles was again defeated. "Better luck next time," said the Barker, and even Charles's date told him that he had done really well. Charles knew that he would never be great until he beat this machine, though. The pieces appeared. Charles set his up, and they began what would be their 4th game. Charles, strategically meeting the machine's offensive plays with his own practiced gambits, would gladly admit that the 3 games he had played against the great Gizmo had improved his chess game more than any other matches he had ever played. Charles had faced old-timers in the park, grand masters at chess tournaments, and everything in between. Despite it all, the great Gizmo never ceased to amaze and test his skill. Charles tried not to think of that last match. It was a match where Charles had done the one thing he promised he would never do. He had cheated. The great Gizmo had become something of a mania in him after he had lost to it a second time. He'd gone to college, married his sweetheart, and began a job that paid well and wasn't terribly difficult. With his business acumen, Charles had been placed as the manager of a textile mill. Soon, he had bought it and was running the mill himself. Charles had turned the profits completely around after he had purchased the mill, seeing what the owner was doing wrong and fixing it when the mill belonged to him. He'd come a long way from the little kid who sat in the tent at Coney Island, but That tent was never far from his mind. Charles had one obsession, and it was chess. Even his father had told him he took the game far too seriously. He and his father still played at least twice a week, and it was mostly a chance for the two to talk. His father was not able to work the train yard anymore. He'd lost a leg to one of the big locomotives when it had fallen out of the hoist onto him, but that hardly mattered. His father lived at the home that Charles shared with his wife, a huge mansion on the main street of town, and his days were spent at leisure now. "You're the best chess player I've ever met, Charlie, but you take it too seriously. It's just a game, an entertainment, but you treat every chess match like a war." Charles would laugh when he said these things, but his father was right. Every chess match was a war, and the general behind all those lesser generals was the great Gizmo. He had seen the old golem in various fairs and sideshows, but he had resisted the urge to go and play again. He couldn't beat him, not yet, and when he did play him, he wanted to be ready. He had studied chess the way some people study law or religion. He knew everything, at least everything that he could learn from books and experience, but it appeared he had one more teacher to take instruction from. Charles liked to go to the park and play against the old-timers that stayed there. Some of them had been playing chess longer than he'd been alive, and they had found ways to bend or even break the established rules of strategy. On the day in question, he was playing against a young black man. He called himself Kenny, and when he had taken Charles's rook, something strange happened. The rook was gone, but so had his knight that had been beside it. Charles knew the knight had been there, but when he looked across the board, he saw that it was sitting beside the rook on Kenny's side. He still won the match. Charles was at a point where he could win with nearly any 4 pieces on the board, but when they played again, he reached out and caught Kenny by the wrist as he went to take his castle off the board. In his hand was a pawn as well, and Kenny grinned like it was all a big joke. Charles wasn't mad, though. On the contrary. The move had been so quick, so smooth, that he hadn't even seen it the first time. He wondered if it would work for a creature that did not possess sight. It might be just the edge that he was looking for. "Hey, man, we ain't playing for money or nothing. There's no need to get upset over it." "Show me," Charles asked, and Kenny was more than happy to oblige. Kenny showed him the move, telling him the piece he palmed always had to be on the right of the piece that you would take. If it's on the left, they focus on that piece. If it's on the right, though, then the piece is practically hidden by the one you just put down. You can't hesitate. It's got to be a smooth move. But if you're quick enough, and you're sure enough, it's damn near undetectable. Charles practiced the move for hours, even using it against his own father, something he felt guilty about. He could do it without hesitation, without being noticed, and he was proud of his progress, despite the trickery. He was practicing it for 2 years before he got the chance to take on the great Gizmo again. By then, Charles was a master of not just chess, but of that little sleight of hand. He hadn't dared use it at any of the chess tournaments. The refs were just too vigilant, as were the players. But in casual games, as well as at the park, he had become undetectable by any but the most observant. He was good enough to do it without hesitation, and when he opened his paper and saw a squib that the great Gizmo would be at Coney Island that weekend, right before going overseas for a 10-year tour, he knew this would be his chance. There was no fee to play against it this time. The barker was still there, but he looked a little less jolly these days. He was an old, fat man who had grown sour and less jovial. He looked interested in being gone from here, in getting to where he would be paid more for the show. He told Charles to take a spot in line, and as the players took their turns, many of them people Charles had bested already, they were quickly turned away with a defeat at the hands of the golem. The great Gizmo looked downright dapper as he sat there, seeing that the man had gotten him a new robe and a feather for his journey. The eyes still sparkled knowingly, however, and Charles settled himself so as not to be thrown by any declaration of future knowledge this time. The pieces came out, and the game began. Charles did well at first. He was cutting a path through the great Gizmo's defenses, and the thing again told him they would play 8 more times before the end. That was a constant, it seemed, but after that, the match turned ugly. The great Gizmo recaptured some of his pieces and set them to burning. Charles was hurting, but still doing well. He took a few more, received his next expected bit of prophecy, and then the play became barbaric. The great Gizmo was playing very aggressively, and Charles had to maneuver himself to stay one step ahead of the thing. He became desperate, trying to get the old golem into position, and when he saw the move, he took it. He had palmed a knight and a pawn when something unexpected happened. The great Gizmo grabbed his hand, just as he had grabbed Kenny's, and it leaned down until its eyes were inches from his. It breathed out, its breath full of terrible smoke and awful prophecy, and Charles began to choke. The smoke filled his mouth, taking his breath, and he blacked out as he fell sideways. The thing let go of him as he fell, but his last image of the great Gizmo was of its 2 expressive eyes watching him with disappointment. He'd been found wanting again, and Charles wondered before passing out if there would be a 4th time. Charles woke up 3 days later in the hospital, his wife rejoicing that God had brought him back to them. By then, the great Gizmo was on a boat to England, out of his reach. The year after that, World War II would erupt, and Charles had feared that he would never get another match with this creature. The match began as it always did. Charles put aside the great Gizmo's gambits, one at a time. He played brilliantly, thwarting the golem's best defenses, and then it came time to attack. He cut the great Gizmo to shreds, his line all a tatter, and when he told him that they would play 8 games before the end, Charles knew he was advancing well. He had lost barely any pieces of his own, and as the thing began to set its later plans in order, he almost laughed. This was proving to be too easy. The great Gizmo and the Barker had been in Poland when it fell to the Blitzkrieg, and the great Gizmo had dropped off the face of the earth for a while. Charles had actually enlisted after Pearl Harbor, but not for any sense of patriotism. He had a mania growing in him, and it had been growing for years. He knew where the thing had last been, and he meant that he would find the Barker and his mysterious machine. The Army was glad to have him, and his time in college made it easy to become an officer after basic training. They offered him a desk job, something in shipping, but he turned them down. If he wanted to find the great Gizmo, he would have to go to war. He had fought at Normandy and Paris and 100 other skirmishes, and that was where he discovered something astounding. Despite the danger that Charles put himself in, he didn't die. Charles was never more than slightly wounded, a scratch or a bruise, but sustained no lasting damage. He wondered how this could be, but then he remembered the words of the great Gizmo. "You will live far longer than you may wish to." He returned home after the war, but the old construct never returned to America. It took a while for his contacts to get back on their feet, but eventually what he got were rumors and hearsay. He heard that Hitler had taken the thing, adding it to his collection of objects he believed to be supernatural. He heard it had been destroyed in a bombing run over Paris, He heard one of MacArthur's generals had taken it as the spoil of war, and many other unbelievable things. After the war, it was supposed to have been taken to Jordan, then to Egypt, to Russia, to South Africa, and finally back to Europe. But he never could substantiate these things. And all the while, Charles grew older, less sturdy, but he never died. He was over 100 years old now, 106 to be precise, but he could pass for a robust 50 most of the time. He had buried his wife, all 3 of his children, 2 of his grandchildren as well. He lost his youngest son to Vietnam and his oldest grandson to the Iraq War. He was trying to keep his great-grandson from enlisting. They all seemed to want to follow in his footsteps, but they couldn't grasp that he had not done this for his country. "Checkmate," he spat viciously as he conquered his old rival. He had gone to war not for his wife or the baby in her arms, or even for the one holding her hand. He had gone to war for this metal monstrosity and the evil prophecy that it held. "Well played," it intoned, and he hated the sense of pride that filled him at those words. "You may ask one question, any question, and I will answer it for you. You have defeated the great Gizmo, and now the secrets of the universe are open to you." Some men would have taken this chance to learn the nature of time, the identity of God, maybe even the night's lotto numbers, but there was only one question that interested Charles. "How much longer will I live?" The great Gizmo sat back a little, seeming to contemplate the question. "You will live for as long as there is a great Gizmo. Our lives are connected by fate, and we shall exist together until we do not." Charles thought about that for a long time, though he supposed he had known all along what the answer would be. The man behind the counter looked startled when the old man approached him and asked to buy the great Gizmo. "That old thing?" he asked, not quite believing it. "It's an antique, buddy. I picked it up in Maine, hoping it would draw in some extra customers, but it never did. Thing creeps people out." "It creeps me out, too, if I'm being honest. I guess I'd sell it to you for $1,500. That's what I paid for it, and I'd like to get at least what I paid back for the damn thing." Charles brought out a money clip and peeled $2,000 bills from it. He handed them to the man, saying he would have men here to collect it within the hour. "Hey, pal, you paid me too much. I only wanted—" "The rest is a bonus for finding something I've searched for my whole life." He called the men he had hired to move the thing, and stayed there until they had it secured on the truck. Charles had a spot at the house for it, a room of other treasures that he had found while looking for the old golem. The walls were fire retardant, the floor was concrete, the ceiling was perfectly set to never fall or shift. Charles had been keeping a spot for the great Gizmo for years, and now he would keep him and himself for as long as forever would last. Or at least, he reflected, for 4 more chess matches. Wasn't that what the great Gizmo had promised him, after all? Good evening, everyone. It's me, Dr. Plague. I'm glad you made it to the end of the story. Thanks for stopping by. If you think you might like a little more spooky in your life, well, there should be some links popping up at the end of this to other great stories, maybe even some great playlists that you can discover. We update 7 nights a week, so there's always something new and something spooky waiting for you on the channel. If you like your spooky a little more tactile, there should be some links to Amazon down in my description, so go have a look over there. It should get you to all my latest books. Speaking of books, I've got my first horror novel, Towsy Homestead, available for purchase on Amazon. It's my first horror novel, so I'd really appreciate it if you'd go give it a look and maybe give it a buy too. If you'd like to support the channel, we have a subscription program here on YouTube, but we've also got a Patreon with lots of tiers and lots of different rewards. For example, our Spooky Skeleton contributors get their spooky 12 hours early. That's right, they get their videos at 8:30 a.m. as opposed to 8:30 p.m. Ghostly Reader tier contributors, that's a tier that's only available on Patreon, I'm afraid, get a book anytime I write one, signed and on their doorstep, hopefully in a timely manner. So, however you support the channel, whether it's monetarily or by enjoying our great videos here, thank you so much. Speaking of patrons, before we go, let's go ahead and thank them. Thanks to Sara, Unicorn Hollow, JustAmy, and Cinnamon Fox for being our spooky ghost contributors. Thanks to Shannon McGhee, Janet, Lee Kendall, Ronda J, Sue Casper, Valinar, CleoHarperReturns, Sara, and Queen Sheebah for being our spooky skeleton contributors. And thanks to Oh Snap, Winter, Xaronan, Stephanie Carrington, Tyler Parker, Grim Reaper, TomBoiTopUwU, Queen Sheebah, MissNewBooty, and Alex Connor for being our Ghostly Reader tier contributors. Thanks everyone, we just couldn't do the show without you. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.